Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this webinar at which, as Doug has said, we are very fortunate to be able to have a conversation with Professor Peter Mathieson, Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the University of Edinburgh. The Asia Scotland Institute, which I founded, was in fact launched in the university 8 years ago. And we are conscious and very grateful to the university for its support as we build on our mission, which is to educate and inspire tomorrow's leaders in Scotland and through informing people in Scotland about events in Asia. For those of you perhaps who don't know, the University of Edinburgh, founded in 1582, is the 6th oldest university in the English-speaking world. The university has 5 main campuses in the city of Edinburgh and played an important role in leading Edinburgh to its reputation as the intellectual centre during the Age of Enlightenment. The university is also a member of both the Russell Group and the League of European Research Universities, which is a consortium of 21 research universities in Europe. And alumni of the university, other than many of those who are listening in on this call, include some of the major figures of modern history, including 3 signatories of the American Declaration of Independence, and it's from America that I'm speaking at the moment, and 9 heads of state and government, including 3 prime ministers of the United Kingdom. This is a really critical moment for all universities in the UK. And Peter has agreed to address the challenges of leading a large university in the context of COVID, with a particular focus on matters such as the approach to and the redesign of teaching and training, the acquisition of students, particularly from China and elsewhere, maintaining research and development faculty activity, and the associated financial challenges. And Peter is particularly well qualified to do this. He assumed office as the 15th President and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Hong Kong, a post he held from April 2014 until January 2018. And he became Principal and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Edinburgh in February 2018. And as Principal, he's responsible for the overall operation of the university, and as Vice-Chancellor, confers degrees on behalf of the Chancellor, Her Royal Highness the Princess Royal. Peter, it's terrific to have you on this call, and I wonder if you'd like to start us off with your reflections on how you see the world of higher education and the university, and then we can move on from there with other questions. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Roddy, and thank you for joining me at what is a very early hour in the morning for you and a convenient time for me. So thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to join you, and it's a pleasure to have been part of some of the Asia Scotland Institute events since I've been in Edinburgh, and I'm happy for that relationship to continue and flourish in the way that it has so far done. I would say that the University of Edinburgh at the moment is in about as good a condition as could be expected in the circumstances. I think I'll expand a bit more about that. And I think the sector as a whole, of which the University of Edinburgh is part, both in Scotland and in the UK, and of course on the wider global stage, is bracing itself for a period of ongoing uncertainty, but has done an enormous amount to mitigate the risks and to try and understand the risks. And just going back to one of the points you made in your introduction, this is a point that I've talked about and written about. Universities are extraordinarily resilient organizations. So universities around the world, some of them in Europe, are hundreds of years old, as you've said. Edinburgh is one of the old ones in Scotland. And universities have survived war and social disorder and famine and upheaval in all sorts of ways over the years, which implies that they are resilient organizations and that they're respected and required by society. It doesn't mean that we can be complacent and that nothing can disrupt the university. That's certainly not the case, but it does mean that we are very resilient organizations, and that's a source of comfort, I think, to people like me, trying to be the current steward of a centuries-old organization and having that responsibility, that heritage, weigh heavily on my shoulders. The university's been here for over 400 years, and I'm only a transient visitor. And my part of my responsibility is to make sure that the next 400 years is not disrupted by my period in office. So the external environment that we face with coronavirus is, of course, completely unprecedented. As you know, I'm a medical graduate by background, and so the medical profession has been conscious of the pandemic risk for all of my medical career. We've always talked about it. Some years ago, when I was a consultant in the kidney doctor in the National Health Service in Bristol as part of my academic post in Bristol. We prepared for bird flu at that time, and we stockpiled drugs that were thought to be effective against bird flu. There was no vaccine against bird flu at that time, but as you will remember, bird flu never really became a pandemic. But we've had this pandemic preparedness for a long time, and the medical profession has always known that viruses are terribly dangerous. We don't have very good antiviral drugs, and unless we have a vaccine which can prevent viral infection, we are fairly defenseless against a virulent virus. What's happened with coronavirus is that that's come true. Personally, I still don't think this is necessarily the biggest pandemic that we'll ever have to face. And this has been a nasty and unpredictable virus, and it's been very widespread. But the mortality rate probably is relatively low. We don't really know for sure. We think that the mortality is very much age-related and underlying disease-related. And so this has not been the virus that will come along and wipe out very large numbers of young, previously healthy people. It's a nasty virus, no question, and it's certainly unpredictable in some of its effects. But it's not perhaps as bad as it could have been. So that's just something to bear in mind. And there will be more viral pandemics, unfortunately, in the future. Whether they'll be in my lifetime or not, I don't know, but there will be more. So we've had to respond to the impact of that. And what it's done for the university sector, and University of Edinburgh has been very prominent in some of these discussions, is that it's exposed in the UK a fragility of our system, which is deeply concerning and needs to be addressed. And that fragility is that we depend disproportionately on two things for the generation of income, which will allow us to continue to invest in the future of the university. Most of our activities don't generate income. So research, much as we want to be internationally active in research and we want to be excellent at our research in general does not generate surplus. It does not generate income. If we're lucky, it covers its costs. More commonly, it doesn't cover its costs and it requires cross-subsidy from other sources. But research is not a money-making activity. It's a reputation-making activity, and it's a new knowledge-making activity, but it does not make financial surplus. And so if we want to create financial surplus in order to ensure the future of the university, there's only two ways we can do it. One is, well, two major ways. One is on those students where the tuition fees that we can charge are not capped. And that means international students, because for home students, for Edinburgh and indeed for all universities in the UK, home student fees are capped. And so the only student fees where we're uncapped and can therefore make more of a surplus is on international student fees. So that's one source of income. Now, of course, there are many, many other reasons why we want to encourage international students. It's absolutely not just about the income. We want an international cosmopolitan community that benefits the home students as well, and it benefits the local economies of all of our universities, because these students bring visitors, they bring income, and they bring expenditure. But certainly that's one source of income for universities. And the second source of income for universities is what we in Edinburgh call other. So under the accounting heading of other, which is accommodation, catering and events. So it's not primarily teaching or research, it's accommodation, catering and events. We can generate surplus on those activities, and that surplus can be reinvested because we're a non-profit organisation. Those two sources of income, international students and accommodation, catering and events, have been very severely impacted by the pandemic. And if you were designing a university system, you would not design it based on some fragile source of income which can be disrupted by external events beyond your control. And what the pandemic has done is illustrate the severity of that. And both governments, UK government and Scottish government, have responded. They've responded to that recognition, and they've given us additional short-term funding for the support of research, particularly for early career researchers whose careers are very fragile, often on short-term contracts. And a few months of disruption of their research is very serious to their career progression. So the governments have recognized it, but what still needs fixed is that underlying fragility in the longer term, because we should learn from this episode that lesson, that if we want our world-leading higher education system in the UK to be secure, we have to make sure that we're not vulnerable to external events like this one, because there are other possible external events. I'll probably stop at that point, Roddy, because I guess we'll go into some of those points in more detail.
Peter, yes, thank you very much indeed for that. There seems to me there's a sort of double whammy, or between a rock and a hard place, because whereas COVID-19 was obviously not expected, thank you for talking about that, you were already aware of the consequences of Brexit, the withdrawal from Erasmus, and the need to do something about attracting students. Could I just ask you to talk a little bit about how your relationship, the university's relationship with Edinburgh, with Europe and the universities there will be affected by Brexit?
Yeah, so you're right that we knew about Brexit, but I don't think we actually did know about the consequences of Brexit, because so much of that was still shrouded in uncertainty, and indeed to some extent still is. So Brexit has now happened. You know, we have left the EU, and the issues for the two major issues for university around that are firstly around people, particularly the mobility of students and staff. So at the University of Edinburgh, almost a quarter of our academic staff are from the EU, and a substantial number of our students is also from the EU. And as you say, we have lots of important partnerships with other EU universities, and indeed with governments and other organisations across the EU. So mobility of people, which is obviously interrupted by Brexit and depends a little bit on what agreements are made with EU nations. That's a very serious concern for us. And the other serious concern for us is the access to European funding, particularly research funding. So I should say, under the mobility, one of the central planks of student mobility for recent years has been the Erasmus programme. And the University of Edinburgh is the largest importer and exporter of students under Erasmus in the entire UK. So we have a higher number of students coming in and going out under Erasmus than any other university in the UK. And in the year that's just completed, this data is not yet public, but we've had an increased share of Erasmus this year compared to any previous year. So we're going out with a bang, but it's likely that in future we will not be able to participate in Erasmus. We don't know that for sure yet, but that's the way it's looking. And so we're really keen that the UK government comes up with a scheme to replace Erasmus. That's really important for our student mobility, including some programs where international attachments are mandatory as part of the programs, particularly in the modern language programs. Then there's the whole question of European research funding. There's the European Research Council, which again, very prestigious funding, which Edinburgh does disproportionately well at, and indeed Scotland does disproportionately well at as a whole compared to the rest of the UK. So we're very successful with EU research funding applications. Horizon 2020, which is the programmatic research funded by the EU, very important source of income, and we're going to lose that unless we associate with the successor programs in the years to come. And that's still the subject of negotiations as part of the EU withdrawal bill. So we don't yet know the full consequences of Brexit, but they are potentially serious for two very major reasons. I've already said that research doesn't make money, so therefore losing access to a research fund doesn't necessarily impact the finances quite as much as the pandemic has done. But what it does impact is our ability to participate in research with EU partners, and also, very importantly, our ability to have thought leadership in Europe. It's not just a question of applying for grants, it's a question of shaping the priorities, contributing to the debates, being around the table when funding decisions are made. We lose all of that when we leave the EU. So we become just a sort of passive participant, if you like, able to apply, but not able to lead or to shape thinking. And that for British universities is very serious. I suppose the final point I'd make about the EU is that if you look at university league tables, and the league tables are flawed for all sorts of reasons, but all the top ranked universities in the EU up till the end of 2019 have now left the EU because they're all in the UK. So all of the top 50 universities that were in the EU are now no longer in the EU because they're all in the UK. And the non-UK universities, the highest ranked is in the order of 50 odd in the world. So Edinburgh, which is ranked 20, Oxford and Cambridge and UCL, which are ranked even higher, they've all left the EU now. And so EU universities do realise that they need to collaborate with top universities. They want to be partners with us. LERU, that you mentioned, is a very important organisation to us. We were founder members of LERU, which is a great group of European universities of which we're proud to be a member. That gives us lots of good partnerships. And we're also part of a number of other alliances, including a new one called Una Europa, which was launched actually prior to Brexit, but looks as if it could be very significant. It's 8 universities in 8 different language jurisdictions, in fact, speaking a total of 9 languages, because the University of Helsinki is a bilingual university. So 8 universities speaking 9 different languages, a very distinguished group of universities. We're very proud to be part of that alliance, and we have some very imaginative ideas about the ways in which we can use that partnership, not just to counteract the risks of Brexit, but to counteract the risks of coronavirus as well. And so, again, I can come back to that, but we're thinking about how we might be able to use some of these very deep partnerships to make sure that our contribution to the wider world is not disrupted by these external events.
Peter, thank you. Before opening it up to the floor, and there will be, I'm not sure, lots of questions. The other great issue that affects everyone, of course, are the tensions between the United States and China and the trade war. And I know that you have a substantial number, normally, of students and researchers from China. And you yourself, of course, having been principal of the University in Hong Kong, know a great deal about that part of the world prior to your arrival in Edinburgh. Would you like to comment on the relationship between China and perhaps the Communist Party of China, we should always remember that, and the university sector in the UK?
Yeah, so the University of Edinburgh has, at full complement, last year we had about 4,000 students from Greater China, the majority from mainland China, but some also from Hong Kong, Macau and Taiwan. We were expecting another 3,000 this summer. So we were expecting the proportion of Chinese students to increase, because our applications from Greater China have been going steeply up in the last year or two. And so we were expecting to increase what was already a very high proportion of Chinese students. Now, of course, that has been disrupted by coronavirus, and as things currently stand, I just have no idea how many of those Chinese students will actually be able to get here. We're pretty confident they still want to come. The applications are actually up compared to last year, but that applications are just applications. They don't mean that students have actually managed to get here. So with travel restrictions, with the concerns about safety, and with various different public health situations in different countries, there is an enormous amount of uncertainty. And as things stand, you know, 12th of August, it'll be another month before I know for sure how many international students are able to get here. For those that can't get here, we're going to provide online education as best we can. And Edinburgh's good at that, and we were good at it before all this, and we've got even better at it in the last few weeks. So we're pretty confident that we can provide high quality digital education for people, but we'd much rather do it in a hybrid way. In other words, they'll be in Edinburgh and they'll have some part of their education face to face, and it'll only be the very large lectures that we can't do because of social distancing that are likely to be unable to be run normally for the next foreseeable future. So we don't know whether those students will be able to get here. The second largest group of international students that the University of Edinburgh has is from the United States of America. Yeah. And until 2 years ago, the North American contingent was the biggest. It was bigger than China. It's been overtaken by China in the last couple of years, but before that's because Chinese numbers have been going up. American numbers have been holding steady. Chinese numbers have gone up and have overtaken. So the second largest group is from the United States. So just with those two facts alone, you can see that I don't want to have to choose between the United States and China. I want both. And we have research partnerships with both. We have on the campus in Edinburgh, in one of our new buildings, the building we call the Bay Centre, we have both Huawei and Cisco working in the same building. And so, you know, we have collaborations with the United States and with China, and we don't want to be forced by politics or by external events to have to choose between one or the other. We will always do, and I will always do, what I consider to be in the best interest of the university. And if there is a relationship that I think is not in the best interest of the university, then it's my job to address that. But I don't want those decisions to be forced on us by politics. I've written about this, particularly when I worked in Hong Kong. I really wish that universities could exist without having to be concerned about geopolitics. Now, of course, the reality is that we cannot. We're not insulated from it. We're part of society, so we have to respond in the same way. But I want the decisions to be made on the best interest of the university rather than the best interest of any particular politician. I do think that the American presidential election on the 3rd of November will be significant here. I think between now and then we can expect to see continued turbulence in US-China relations. After the 3rd of November, depending a bit on the result, that may change, I just don't know. But certainly for the foreseeable future, this is going to be an issue for us. And then I suppose the final thing I'd say, and some people on the call have heard me say this sort of thing before, in my opinion, one of the major challenges to the University of Edinburgh, and indeed every other university like us, is actually nothing to do with Asia or North America. It's to do with the African continent. I think the way in which we engage with the African continent in the future will be really, really important. Africa is the site of the population explosion which is happening there, but not anywhere else in the world. So of the next 3 billion people to be born on the planet, 2 billion of them will be in Africa. And so there's going to be massive population explosion. There's also great climate risk to the African continent. Parts of it may become uninhabitable, so there may well be migration from the African continent. And I saw some population demographic predictions the other day which said that by 2050, so only 30 years from now, Nigeria will be the second most populous country on the planet. It'll overtake China because in China the birth rate is low. And although at the moment the Chinese population is still rising because people are living longer, as the demographic hits and the low birth rate is not high enough to replace the older people that are dying, Chinese population starts to fall. Nigerian population is still rising. So in 2050, according to these predictions, India will be the most populous country on the planet and Nigeria will be second. And that's quite a sobering fact.
Very, very interesting and difficult when building in your strategy for the long term. Peter, thank you. Now I'm going to ask Doug Cook, our director, to start fielding the questions from those who are listening in. Thank you.
Roddy, thank you very much indeed. The first question, Fiona Godsman, if you would perhaps ask your question, please.
Hi, yes, hi. It's been very interesting so far, thank you. I'm Fiona Godsman from Scottish Institute for Enterprise. I'm particularly interested in these very uncertain times to what you're doing with your current students to help them to build some resilience and the skills they need to thrive in this very uncertain world.
Shall I just go ahead, Doug, and you can answer, want me to do them one by one? Yeah. Fiona, thank you very much. Well, so clearly a very important question for me, also for leaders of other universities, also for leaders of colleges, particularly in Scotland, and also for businesses and employers. I think there's a lot discussed about skills, and there's been a lot of debate about that recently, because clearly we're facing a significant recession that's just been announced this morning, but we've all known it's coming. We're facing job losses. Even prior to coronavirus, there was a real issue which we've been trying to address, and other universities have been trying to address, and actually I should say was particularly well addressed by the University of Hong Kong when I was there, and I'll come back to that in a moment, which is how to provide graduates with the transferable and flexible and adaptable skills that we think they will need for their future employment. The days of preparing someone for a single profession, which they're then going to continue for the rest of their days, are long gone. And the statistics are that the university graduate of today will probably have 6 or 7 different careers during their lifetime. And the median time between graduation and the first change of career is less than 2 years. So people are going to be going into a very changing world. They need transferable skills. And there's a lot of debate about whether standard university education provides those skills or not. We believe that we take clever young people, we give them an environment in which they can flourish. We try to ensure that they have a mixture of both specialist knowledge and general knowledge. But are we actually designing our programs to provide skills to the extent that we would wish to do so or not? There's a bit of a tendency to think that what in Scotland we call further education colleges, but in other parts of the world are called technical colleges or community colleges. Those are more skills focused. They're more aligned to professions than perhaps university education. And I think we need to address that and do something about it. Coronavirus does change all that. It makes the recession more immediate. It makes the employment situation more difficult, and it makes the need for transferable skills very much greater. But I would argue that all of those problems were there before coronavirus. We just need to think about it. Just a word about the University of Hong Kong. I mean, when just before I moved to Hong Kong, Hong Kong decided to move from the standard 3-year undergraduate curriculum based on the English model to a 4-year undergraduate curriculum. And so we had the challenge of saying, what are we going to do with that additional year? And the University of Hong Kong, where I was president, and of course I'm not impartial when I say this, but I think the University of Hong Kong did it better than virtually any other university, in that we devised a first year which gave students a very broad general and practical education. So irrespective of what their major subject of study was going to be, they would do a series of core curriculum programs in 4 streams. There were about 170 odd programs they could choose from, one of each in 4 streams. And they spent a lot of time in their first year and a bit of time in their second year doing general education, so that everybody emerging from that degree should have some level of general education as well as their specialist knowledge in their chosen subject. Something like that, I think, could be applied much more broadly. And since I've arrived in Edinburgh, we have been thinking those thoughts about, we already have a 4-year undergraduate curriculum. And so obviously in Scotland, we have 4 years already, whereas in England, the standard undergraduate curriculum is 3 years. But so the question is, what should we do with that 4 years? Do we have the space to create general education and marry it to skills that we expect employers to be looking for? It's a work in progress, frankly. It's much harder to change an existing 4-year undergraduate curriculum than it is to add a year to a 3-year undergraduate curriculum, because obviously if we're going to change it, we've got to stop doing some things. And as you and others will well know, persuading people to stop doing things is much harder than persuading people to do new things.
Thank you.
Peter,
thank you very much.
Peter, thank you very much indeed. I've got a question from Peter de Vink. Peter, if you'd like to ask your question, please.
Right. First of all, Peter Mathieson, thank you so much for a fascinating address to the Asia Scotland Institute. You and I have talked about this often. Other ways in which the university can earn money, and other than from students and what you call catering and hospitality, it's also the amazing amount of intellectual properties that you have got. And I feel the University of Edinburgh could do more from a business point of view, setting up more ventures and really earning significant returns from companies that they have a joint venture with. And particularly, you know, you putting in the intellectual properties could demand something like 50% of the equity of a group of people that have really the imagination and the ability to create wealth. Thank you.
Yep. So, Peter, nice to see you. And yes, you and I have indeed talked about this issue and related issues. I mean, there are two additions. The reason I said earlier on that the main areas for a university to make surplus are international students and accommodation, catering, and events. The reason I qualified that to say the main rather than the only is because there are 2 other areas. One is the one that you highlight, and the other one is philanthropic income. The University of Edinburgh has just completed its best ever year in terms of philanthropic income. We've had a fantastic year in terms of attracting big donations. It's the best year we've ever had, but it's still small beer compared to the income that we need to run the university. The same, unfortunately, at the moment is true of research commercialization and intellectual property exploitation. We do make some money on those areas, but it's small. I mean, the figures are, the figures go like this. The University of Edinburgh has an annual turnover of £1.2 billion. It costs about £90 million a month to keep the university open. So to pay the bills, to pay the salaries, to pay the utilities and the running costs and everything else that goes with a university of this size costs about £90 million a month. So our fantastic philanthropic income this year wouldn't even pay the bills for 1 month, even though we've done really, really well. And so in order to make the sums of money that we're talking about, it's got to be something really at scale. And so whilst research commercialization is enormously important, and actually again, Edinburgh, and I think you've probably seen these numbers, Edinburgh has done dramatically well in the last 3 or 4 years. 4 years ago, Edinburgh was 15th in the UK for its income from industry. Currently, with the data just published a couple of months ago, we're now 4th in the UK, and we're pretty close on the heels of Manchester, who's 3rd. So we're rising fast in that particular yardstick, but it's still relatively small compared to the annual turnover of the university. The only university in the UK where it's anything other than small is Oxford. They're streets ahead of everybody else. But for most other universities, whilst there is, and I quite agree with you, there is potential for more exploitation of IP, but I don't think universities generally have got their IP policies right. I think there's a bit too much protectionism, and certainly as a researcher myself, I was a medical researcher working on some obscure aspects of the kidney which happened to excite me but wouldn't necessarily excite the whole world. But we had over the years definitely some commercially exploitable discoveries, and at no point in my career did I bother, because it was just too difficult. I just wanted to get on with writing the next paper and doing the next presentation, and all the hurdles that were in my way of research commercialization just actually put me off. And there must be lots of researchers that feel like that. So I think generally universities do need to be more imaginative about the way in which they reward discovery, and that can include better processes for research commercialization. But unfortunately, unless it was absolutely massive scale, it's not going to be enough to pay the daily bills.
Peter, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to ask Craig if he would ask his question next, please.
Peter, I'm going to ask you about how we can innovate more structurally within the university. I know there's been a huge amount of work in adapting our delivery here at Edinburgh for students going online. There's obviously, we've been embracing online for our international students in China and America can get the best possible experience while delivering online through their homes. As you know better than anyone, in China often the size of the home is quite small, the space isn't great, and so the students are desperate not to be based at home often to have that experience. So I'm wondering what we can do at the University of Edinburgh to explore different models and different thought processes regarding how we could really engage with our international students to improve the experience if they can't travel to Edinburgh, which is obviously where we want them to go, and give that experience forward. And the second part of that question is, we have, my belief is we've been traditionally relatively academic-led in our partnership approach, and how we can take a more preferred partnership approach to deepen and enhance that experience, not just for students, but building on Peter's question, to add a richness to our income and our partnership within those preferred partners.
Thanks very much, Ed. Well, yeah, so very thoughtful question. I mean, the quick, well, there's a sort of philosophical point, and then there's a practical point. So the philosophical point, I think, is, are we talking here about a relatively short-term disruption to our normal modus operandi, which, however long it carries on and however long it is until the world gets a grip on coronavirus, we need to think of short-term mitigation measures? Or are we thinking about something more fundamental that's actually going to change the way we do things forever? Now, I'm very firmly in the school of thought that it's the latter, not the former. And so, therefore, yes, we've inevitably had to make some very short-term decisions. We've had to react very quickly to extraordinary circumstances, and we will have made some mistakes. There will be some things that we didn't do properly. There will be things that we've missed, and there will be things that we've done that we perhaps shouldn't have done. Inevitably, we will have made mistakes, but we've been reacting in a dramatically quick way to very fast-moving external events. I think there's got to be a process of learning from that. I mean, we were already trying to do innovative things. We were already, as you well know, we're already trying to embrace climate sustainability and reduce travel as much as we can. We were already trying to think about renewable energies and whatnot. We were already trying to think about how we can foster our international linkages. If the world is going to be one where travel, physical travel, is constrained, either by the economies or by public health concerns or by legislation, by travel restrictions, whatever the reason, then we have to do those things in a different way. And I personally believe we will never go back to the old ways of doing things, and I think generally that's probably a good thing. So we've all become very, like this conference we're doing now, it's possible to talk to however many it is, 50 odd people with a Zoom conference. The previous dogma was that it's very easy to interact electronically with somebody that you already know and you already have a relationship with. That then can be transferred into an electronic format. What people I think were more dubious about before was whether you can build relationships electronically without actually physically getting together with people. And I just think we've learned through necessity in the last few months that the answer to that is yes, you can. It's perfectly possible. And this obsession that we've had of personal contact, you know, flying halfway around the world to give a one hour talk and then getting back on an airplane to fly home again, which I've done many times and I'm sure you have as well, is nuts. You know, I mean, it's not something that we should be doing in terms of economics or the climate or practicality. So I do think that the way we form relationships will have changed. I mentioned earlier on Una Europa. So Una Europa is a very imaginative alliance of 8 European universities. Before coronavirus hit us, in fact, before we even knew about coronavirus, we were talking about a shared model whereby there would be a single degree offered by these 8 universities, and the student would study at only 2 or 3 of the universities, but they would get the same degree no matter what language they studied in and no matter which universities were their primary location. That is pioneering. That was going to be a degree in European relations, and there was going to be a separate one in climate sustainability. Now that kind of model is, that, as I say, that was pre-coronavirus. We were thinking about that. That would be a first. It would be fantastic if we could come up with something like that. You'd have students studying to a set of common standards, but able to study in different languages in different countries and get an international experience as part of it. Question for us now, and we've been talking about this in Una Europa, is can we still do that without the students physically moving? Can we give students, let's say at the University of Edinburgh, tuition at the University of Helsinki electronically? Can we give them, and the answer for teaching is obviously we can, that's very possible. But can we give them all the other experiences as well? Can we give them language immersion? Can we give them social experiences whilst they stay in their home city? I think it's perfectly possible. And I think there's some really innovative and imaginative thinking going on around that. And then finally, the point you make about Chinese students not wanting to be at home. This has been very noticeable in some of our communications with applicants and with both home students, with both returning students and new students. Generally, the greatest reluctance to have a predominantly online experience is seen amongst Chinese students. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that until relatively recently, the Ministry of Education in Beijing hadn't wished to recognize online degrees as being equivalent to any other form of degree. And there's been some relaxation on that. So the level of recognition that's allowed for overseas degrees that are at least partially done online, at least initially, has been relaxed, and that's been very welcome. And the second is the point that you made about practicality. You know, people may be living in small, cramped circumstances. What people don't realize about China is it's got vast rural areas where connectivity is poor. So everyone knows about the big Chinese cities, but a lot of people live in the countryside. And so it may well be that actually the access to connectivity is not so great. And also Chinese students are looking for a different cultural experience. They're actively deciding to go from China to somewhere else. It used to be predominantly the United States. Now a lot of it is the UK, or it has been Australasia as well. And they want a different cultural experience. And if they stay home, they don't get that. And so there are all sorts of ways in which we have to think, can we provide that cultural experience without the physical need for travel? My personal view is it's perfectly possible, but it's going to require people to think outside the box and to do things very differently to the way that they've been done in the past.
And hopefully that's something we'll be doing with Shanghai Jiaotong this week. Hopefully we'll know. So
yeah, actually, sorry, that's a good reminder. That's the other point that I should have made. Because we have very good relationships, and Shanghai Jiaotong is a very good example. We have very good relationships with universities all over the world. We've had some great discussions about can we have a relationship with them where a student, let's say a student from Shanghai or even from some other part of China that can't leave the country, could they have some of their initial engagement on the Shanghai Jiaotong campus and come to us later? That's one example. There are other examples in other countries where we're having similar discussions. So the answer is possibly that will be a useful measure, but I do think of that as rather more short term. That may not be the way the longer term continues. I think in the longer term we need to be more structured, and we need to be doing it at larger scale as well. Obviously Shanghai Jiaotong has got their own students to take care of. They can't take care of 4,000 Chinese students for us as well, because that would be asking too much. So there'll be some short-term mitigation available with that kind of arrangement. Longer term, we need to think at larger scale.
Thank you.
Peter, thank you. And following on from that, we've got a question from Mr. Gardner. I'm afraid I don't know his first name. Perhaps you could ask your question, please.
Yeah, it's Roy Gardner from the City of Glasgow College. Thank you very much, Peter. I suppose you've answered part of my question in the form of response there. What I was asking was obviously the impact here on international activity from students. Do you see the business model for Edinburgh University changing? And I suppose adding a slightly additional question to that, do you see the UK government relaxing the visa rules around this, particularly post-Brexit, to allow more students to come from all over the world?
Thanks, Roy. Yes, I mean, yes and yes, I think is the quick answer. But I think the business model for universities that I referred to in my introductory remarks is one that works or has worked, but is fragile. And so therefore, I do think that we need to avoid that fragility for the future. So yes, that's why I make the point about research funding. I've been involved in some discussions with the UK government and with UKRI, which is the major research funding body, around the fact that we need to ensure that in the future research is adequately funded so that it doesn't depend on this cross-subsidy. Otherwise, it's fragile. And I think that message has been heard, and so I'm pretty confident that we will see some progress on that. So that's a plus, if you like, in terms of the underlying business model. I do not foresee a situation where universities and colleges, particularly in Scotland, will be less interested in overseas students. I mean, I think there are all sorts of reasons why we want overseas students to come here. You know, Scotland needs immigration. We welcome, you know, Scotland I think of as a welcoming place where immigrants are welcome and are supported and needed for the economy. And you know, we've got a population of 5.5 million compared to England's population, which is 10 times bigger. But our land mass is only about half the size, or slightly more than half the size of England. So, you know, in terms of population density, Scotland, there's plenty of space in Scotland. So, you know, we want people to come, and we also want them to come for their education, because, you know, we've got a fantastic educational heritage in Scotland. So I don't foresee any lack of desire to bring international students to Scotland. But what I do hope to see is less fragility of our dependence on them for financial reasons, so that we can think about all the other reasons why it's great to have them. And sorry, I've forgotten the second half of your question, Roy.
It was really around the visas and the UK government stance.
Yeah, sorry, yes, visas. Well, I mean, the relatively new, now not so new UK government, before coronavirus happened, had made some very helpful promises on visas, particularly on post-study visas. And this has been a major deterrent to students from India from coming to the UK. So India, the UK used to be the second most popular destination for Indian students after the United States. But in recent years, Australia has overtaken us. So India had become less of a source of international students for the UK than it previously had been. In response to the promised changes of post-study visas, even before they'd become enshrined in legislation, we saw a marked increase in number of applications from India. And so there's tremendous potential for India, which as the population of which is almost the same as China now. But we only get about 1/10 of the number of Indian students that we do of Chinese students. And so there's lots of lots of scope for increased scale there. And a lot of it will depend on visa regulations. I do think that the UK government understands that. There's also a Hong Kong connection here. So since Roddy wanted me to mention Hong Kong, I try to at every opportunity, because Hong Kong is a place that I love and enjoyed being and still feel a great deal of affection for. The recent announcement that holders of the so-called BNO passport, so a BNO passport is a British National Overseas Passport, which was granted to Hong Kong residents at the time of the handover in 1997. It used to have relatively limited rights. But what the UK government has recently announced is that the rights of BNO passports holders will be extended, and also they'll be made available to dependents, not just to the passport holders themselves. And that could lead to a significant migration from Hong Kong to the UK. Leaving aside the politics that might be behind that, I think of Hong Kong as hardworking, capable people. And if we were to get an influx of Hong Kongers into the UK, personally, I'd like to see Scotland getting more than its fair share. And I think they would be a very welcome addition to the UK. And so there are things that can happen post-Brexit that perhaps would not have happened pre-Brexit. And in fact, I was talking about this with a Hong Kong friend just this week. And she made the point that when that announcement was made, you didn't see any sort of anti-immigration rhetoric saying, oh, we don't want all those Hong Kongers here, because people think of Hong Kongers as being assets rather than problems. And so there are things I think that the UK can and will need to do post-Brexit to make sure that immigration from other parts of the world is favoured here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Peter, thank you very much indeed. I've got a few more questions I'd like to slip in if we can within the time. So David Wallace, if you'd like to ask your question briefly now, and then I'll try and get some others in shortly afterwards. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Could you say something about the likely Scottish intake numbers given the recent hires results outcome, and particularly perhaps in the light of the fact that I thought that Scottish numbers were capped?
Okay, very topical question, David. The changes that have been announced to the way Scottish school students' performance has been assessed will inevitably lead to an increased number of Scottish students being qualified for university than was previously thought to be the case. That's an inevitable consequence. Exam grades have gone up, and therefore more people will have got the grades that they were expected to get or that they needed to get. The discussion that's happened with Scottish Government and the Scottish Funding Council in the last couple of days has been around three headings. So firstly, capacity. Do we have the capacity to take additional students? A quick answer to that is yes, we do. Secondly, do we have the funding? We can't take these students unless someone pays for them, because in Scotland we require government subsidy for students, and that's why the numbers are capped, is because government obviously needs to know how much money it's allocating. So it's the numbers are capped because we've got to be within that subsidy threshold. And the indications from Scottish Government are that there will be additional funding for these additional students. And that's very welcome, because I think that's an absolute requirement. If we're going to give them the adequate experience and we're going to protect all the other students from any disadvantage, then they've got to be properly funded. And the indications are that they will be. And then the third and perhaps most difficult category is what I call retention. So in other words, it's not just a question of getting these students into university, it's a question of making sure they succeed once they get here. And it could be that they'll need, these larger number of students will need additional support, and that also has costs in terms of time and money. So the consequences are fairly complicated, but the reality is Scottish universities want to be helpful. We would actually like to take more Scottish students, but the numbers have previously been capped. In these circumstances this year, it looks as if we will be able to take more, and they will be properly funded, and that's a good thing. For some universities in Scotland, it's not all of them, but particularly for Edinburgh, Glasgow and St Andrews, A-levels in the rest of the UK, and indeed in some schools in Scotland, the results of which come out tomorrow, will be the next hurdle, because if the same thing happens around A-levels, and it's quite possible it will, then we may well have the same issue to deal with students from the rest of the UK. But I think the quick answer is yes. I think it's probably in some ways a slightly roundabout way of achieving something that we would have wished to achieve anyway, which is taking more students from Scotland.
Good, thank you very much.
Peter, thank you. I have a question from Kevin Cordra. He's not able to ask the question. Perhaps I could ask it on his behalf. He said, with such a large dependency on international students and revenue, how concerned are you on the flow of intellectual property and knowledge from your university? And are there any steps that you're taking to mitigate those?
So this goes back a bit to Peter Vink's question earlier on. I mean, as a general comment, I would say that universities are not making the best of their intellectual property capability. I think that's true for universities across the world. There are some spectacular exceptions. So in Canada, for example, University of Waterloo, in Boston, the MIT, in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. There are some examples, NUS in Singapore, there are some examples where different policies have led to different outcomes. And so I think there's some great examples that we can learn from. I don't see the, I don't necessarily see the dependence on international students as being a major factor in that, except for the point that I made earlier on, which is that if we want to have our research flourishing, it requires cross-subsidy, and at the moment that cross-subsidy comes pretty substantially from international students. So there is a connection there. If the question is more about risks of dependence on any particular country for some of our intellectual property exploitation, then yes, I think that risk is there, and we need to be careful about that. This is where I go back to my point about always trying to make decisions based on the best interests of the university. For any new partnership, for any new source of income, whether it's a company or a government or a commercial contract, we have a very detailed process of due diligence to try and make sure that we're not taking undue risks with the university's reputation or its finances. And I would apply that same thinking no matter which country or which political regime the external party is coming from.
Peter, thank you. Before I hand over to Roddy, perhaps I can squeeze in one last question from Siobhán, if you'd like to ask your question, please.
Thank you very much. And a very brief question for Peter from Siobhán Jordan from Interface. There are many different expectations on universities from local and national governments in terms of the civic and company engagement, perhaps being anchor institutions in their local areas that support wider societal and economic impacts. But as a university, how would you manage these competing priorities when many of them are loss-making, you know, for example, engagement with local companies through talent and knowledge exchanges, but in fact may have wide-ranging ripple effects that really help societal benefits, but there's challenges around the capacity when they are loss-making?
Indeed, Siobhán, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, absolutely agree. My quick answer would be I want both. I don't think this is a binary choice. I don't think you can either be relevant to your local environment or relevant internationally. I think you've got to be both, and I think you can be both. And I think there's some commonality of the ways in which you provide those two functions. For the University of Edinburgh, a real triumph has been what's called the Edinburgh and South East Scotland City Region deal. A bit of a mouthful, so we abbreviate it to City Deal when we talk about it. But there have been a series of city deals around the UK. This is largely UK government money, a bit of Scottish government money, and it involves a collaboration between the City Council in Edinburgh and a number of regional councils, and also between the universities in Edinburgh and some of the colleges. And this is a brilliant alliance of like-minded people trying to make sure that we are relevant to our region of Scotland. So this is the city, but it's also the South East Scotland region. So one of the collaborations, one of the very successful collaborations is actually with Borders College in the south of Scotland. So we are very conscious and very keen to be relevant to our local population and to be a source of economic development for Edinburgh and South East Scotland. That in no way compromises our desire to be a significant player on the international stage. We can do both, and I think the successful universities are doing both, and there are a number of good examples in the UK, and I like to think that the University of Edinburgh is prominent amongst them.
Peter, thank you. I'd like to hand over to Roddy, if I may.
Yeah, well, it'll sound repetitive, but Peter, thank you very much indeed. As usual, time gets a hold of us and we run out after an hour. And I know, I'm sure others would agree, that this is a conversation that could go on for much longer. There's been a lot of questions, a lot of participation, and perhaps I can ask you if at some point in the future we can get together again and you can share thoughts on where we've got to from today's conversation as we move towards the end of the year. But I'm enormously grateful to you, as I said at the beginning, not only for the support of the university for what we do at the Asia Scotland Institute, but for being a thought leader in the field of higher education. And it's a challenge for Scotland. I've always thought with a population the same size as Singapore, it would be nice if we could replicate the success of that particular economy. And the idea of Hong Kong in the Highlands, which I think was once floated about 30 years ago, is very attractive. And of course, the mainly Cantonese population is, as you said, full of entrepreneurial spirit and flair. And it'd be wonderful if we could find a way of indeed accommodating them in Scotland. But Peter, thank you for leading us through a very thoughtful and informative conversation today. So thank you.
My pleasure, Roddy.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody. Have a great day.
Yeah.
My day is earlier than yours. It's now coming up to 6 o'clock. Yeah, it is 6 o'clock in the morning.
Take care, everybody, and go and have a cup of coffee, Roddy. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
All the best. Bye.
Bye, Peter. Bye-bye.